So to get back to the difference between productive and speculative, of course, productive is, employs people. Speculative doesn't. And a lot of the worries about are, world overpopulation and all that sort of thing. The French were beginning to have job sharing and things, and in a really productive, wealthy economy, you don't really worry about that sort of thing. People work less, that's all. You do a 2 or 3 day week, have 5 days off, earn the same amount of money, really. That's the sort of way things are, really. But if you have a sort of a struggling world economy due to these enormous gambling industries, then I'm afraid, this is where you get mass unemployment and not enough money for people to pay for things, and countries getting into debts. Anyway, as I said, all of the world religions, major religions that I know of, which is a massive proportion of the world's population, supposedly adhere to these religions in some form or another. All different versions of the same religion and all that sort of thing. But they do vaguely have this thing, I think, that gambling for a living isn't a good idea. And then, when I actually was going on a moment ago, of course, there is, most people who aren't even religious, they do think, fair day's work for fair day's pay. And in the law, you go along and you put somebody's drive down and somebody thinks you've charged an extra, you chucked a couple of zeros or even just 1 0 on the end of, the cost. Instead of charging 10 quid, you charge 100 or something like that. Or, £10,000, you charge 100,000, things like that, People get very upset and people can even go to prison for it. But, this moving of currencies doesn't actually do any good. In fact, as far as I can see, all it does is destroy the world economy, and it doesn't do anybody, even the people who are doing it, any good. But if you they can't seem to come up with anything that actually does any good. So if you could think of something besides when Adam delved and Eve span, they decided there would just be one extremely rich man, and he'd be that's what it is. All right. But I think that was when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, is what I was trying to say. I think that goes back to the peasants' revolt in the 1300s. I think. Forgotten the name of the guy, I'm afraid. Yeah, a situation can emerge in the future where speculators seek to create good news, bad news in order to influence the markets in their favour and create instability. I don't think I'm going to be giving anybody any ideas here, so don't worry. Sorry. So they can make more money. It's pretty... And also, another thing I'd like to say is, of course, that if you had stability of currencies, whatever I said about the economy really wouldn't matter. It would be a reality situation where, the amount of VWs that were being produced, or, potatoes being produced, are the most important thing, not what some, crackpot says on the, Anyway, there we go. There we go. That's that. I think I can say, really, that sort of covers quite a bit of the stuff. And of course, bread on woods has been ignored. And then of course, I think I can just I know nothing about Angela Merkel, but there was an article, and this is actually going to bring me on to the idea of generalizations. Now, often in a time of economic crisis, we do get these sort of generalizations coming out. The worst example of the generalization, of course, was in Germany that I can think of, is in Germany in about 1933, and before then, after the First World War, when Jewish people were blamed for an international financial crisis. I think maybe this was what you would call fake news, and it was what you would call just total rubbish. Because if you saw some poor German chap, a German Jewish guy, digging a lawn or sitting in a trench the whole way through the First World War, getting medals from his Kaiser, then people like Jewish doctors and nurses. It's as silly as blaming the chap, Muslim doctor who's saving lives after an explosion for the bomb that's killed the people. I mean, you know, it's such generalizations, and we have it all the time. And I think you can see it from the people who talk rubbish. They generalize about stuff. Now, unfortunately, I have generalized about currency dealing, and hopefully I do apologize if I have talked about all currency dealers having done this, that and the other, and I hopefully have not, but anyway, let me just say that as it works out, if Bretton Woods was international law that was actually being enacted, then of course really, you know, all of this of these worries that I have would not be taking place. And I think really people really, if you do deal in currencies, I mean, if nobody dealt in currencies at all, for any reason at all, except for the fact that they're related to industry, in the fact that you're changing euros, which remain exactly the same, with the pound that remains exactly the same, with the dollar that remains exactly the same, all to do with, you know, world trade, then it really doesn't matter. I mean, you can have arguments say, oh well, you know, we can't get on with the world's economy if we don't have changing currencies and currencies going up and down. But unfortunately, the risks and the costs of moving currencies up and down actually cause immense amount of recession. It's a recessionary thing to do, because if you're allowing people to trade on them. Fair enough, if people aren't allowed to gamble and trade on them, then perhaps at international conferences and stuff, then these currencies can be moved, but not with trading, because this is what they were saying, they're gambling on the currencies. This is, I believe, at the heart of Bretton Woods, that you don't gamble on currencies. You do not allow the international financial system to be used as a casino, because this can create basically it can create world poverty and the risks of war. I mean, they say in the Bretton Woods, they say that they are trying to avoid war, in other words, have world peace, and through economic prosperity. So when you consider such risks to be involved in pure speculation on currencies, purely for its own sake, and George Soros in his YouTube video, I think he is saying that we need regulation. And I would say, personally, Bretton Woods, 1944 to 46, took 2 years. Now, they did have a world war, the most awful world war of history, of the whole of history, to sort of strengthen their resolve to come up with a good deal. Now, thank goodness, as yet, we have not had, as far as I can see, a war on anything like the scale of the Second World War. I mean, for a moment, we have to think of 70 million civilian and military casualties, cities laid to waste, 45 million refugees wandering around Europe. Now, there have been some much smaller wars, and this is where I would say this was the difference between these smaller wars, is they're small wars, they're wars. They are not mega wars, they're not world wars. Now, and the sad thing is that we can see that from the little we can see of the way war has been getting more and more dangerous, and how more and more civilian casualties have been getting involved, is that world war seems to be getting a lot more exponentially, if there is a net world war. And it doesn't take a genius to see, with the kind of weapons and the amount of weapons there are around now, that the opportunities for mass destruction have never been so enormous. Then, of course, you've got the World Health Organization, who say that poverty causes disease. Now, we've just had this Ebola outbreak a couple of years ago in Africa. And of course, people know there that according to the World Health Organization, had it been a rich area where people weren't all starving, then Ebola probably would not have taken hold. There are, of course, the diseases, like with AIDS, that these diseases do not stay exactly the same. They can mutate. There could be a problem, for instance, with Ebola, perhaps where it could perhaps become airborne. Then, even if you were in a nuclear bunker, you might find that you could have problems. So that's a reason for encouraging world prosperity. And then, of course, there are the naysayers who will say, whoa, you'll never do anything about world poverty. No, it's always going to happen. It's always going to be there. What I would say to you is the words of Sir Winston Churchill: never, never, never give in. Or to put it in his language, never, never, never give in. And we can see a trend after the Second World War in the 50s and 60s where people agree that we had the most incredible growth that has ever been. That, the greatest social mobility, where somebody from a council house in the Gorbals could end up being doing really well, going to university and being a really useful person for society, and having opportunities, as opposed to the 1930s, where there would have been no education, probably no food, and the person may have been very lucky to have actually made it through childhood. So then it moves on to the idea of the pollution. And of course, with all this, I would say quite obviously that if you're investing all your cash in this currency dealing industry and gambling industries, against the international law of Bretton Woods for world peace through economic prosperity, that in fact what you are doing is you are stopping people from developing new ideas, developing a pathway for eco-friendly energy collection, which will only encourage and make far more cost-effective collecting free energy. Just solar energy, apparently in an afternoon or a day in the Australian desert, you've got enough energy just from heat. I don't think it's even radiation to power the whole planet for a year. So energy, there isn't. To say there is an energy crisis, there isn't. There's a financial crisis that is causing a lack of investment in the eco, which is causing us to get stuck with these silly petrol cars that, for instance, they say the pollution from them is causing 40,000 deaths a year in the UK alone. So we can see there that something Bretton Woods would not have been worried about would have been the pollution thing. They hadn't really realised in those days how polluting nuclear energy was. So everybody's got their own little agenda, but you then move on to charities. Now let's look at charities like Saving the Elephant. Well, if all the people in Africa are so starving and poor that they can't, a lot of them are actually starving to death. To say they're not is, to be honest, is just is disagreeing with the World Health Organization about West Africa, for instance. You might be able to pick out some area of Africa where actually they're all massively rich around the area where elephants are and all that sort of thing. But I personally feel that a lot of the charities that are around and the trades unions, you're not looking at the global problems of not enforcing the international treaty of Bretton Woods. United Nations, July 1944 to 36, a conference of 44 allied nations and 730 perhaps economic experts discussing economic prosperity for world peace, to be ratified by all world parliaments, done and recorded by Hansard through that 1944-46 period. Hansard, of course, is the parliamentary records of the British Parliament, where Winston Churchill was a chap. And I think the Labour Parliament government, there was a Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he was asked by Lord Boothby a question, and he said some stuff, and I think he must have referred to some stuff he'd read in the newspapers, and the Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer, and I think it's very pertinent today, is you can't always believe what you read in the newspapers. And I think, as I've shown here, for instance, that this terrible I'm sorry.